Hello everyone, this is another episode of The Nature of the Future, a series of conversations in which I ask writers from different parts of the world about what's happening today, as well as what will happen in the near and distant future. Today my guest is Raja Shehadeh, a Palestinian writer and lawyer, co-founder of the Al-Hak organization working for human rights, and author of many books, several of which have been translated into Polish. We'll talk about what is happening in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. I propose the formula on the unjust peace as the title of this talk, to point out that all previous attempts to solve the problem between Israel and Palestine have been simply unjust, and that something different is needed. Hello, Raja.
Hello.
Thank you for being with us. Thank you for accepting my invitation. Since October 7th, the world has been watching Israel and Gaza. First, the outrageous attack by Hamas that killed 1,400 of people, mostly civilians, Israeli civilians. Then Israel's retaliation resulting in the deaths of thousands of innocent Palestinians. UNICEF writes about scenes of horror. Observers speak about genocide. People from other parts of the world are looking at this and trying to properly understand the situation. It seems to me that it's difficult to maintain the position that seems to me to make sense, which is to oppose the actions of Hamas, ideology of Hamas, while recognizing the Palestinians' right to have a state, to oppose Israel's occupation politics without criticizing the Jewish community inside and outside of Israel. You have always been a proponent of the third way. You once wrote that when you have to choose between silent submission and blind hatred, you choose the other path. But is that other path even possible today, Raja?
We have to keep thinking that it is possible, because if we give up hope, it will be a disaster. And I think hope must be built on a proper understanding of the situation. And so let me please try and explain how I see the situation emerging, because we cannot start with October 7 because there is an important background before that. In 1948, Israel was established, and 7,500 people were 700,000 people were ethnically cleansed from their homes and lived in refugees outside. And this is in Palestinians called the Nakba, and this has never been recognized by the Israelis. And then in 1967, the Israeli army occupied Gaza Strip and the West Bank. And since then, the occupation has continued relentlessly, and Israel has refused really any attempt at making peace with the Palestinians, because it does not want to recognize the Palestinians' existence as a national group. And that has been a cornerstone of Israeli politics ever since, and it continues to be today the case. Now, over the years, there were many possibilities for peace negotiations, which really Israel always rejected. And the most important one was the Oslo process in 1993. And in 1991, there was the international conference in Madrid. And the Palestinian representative, head of the delegation, appealed to Israelis and said, let's end the bloodshed, let's share the land, and so on. And the Israeli delegation's head, who was Ishaq Shamir, said this is a distortion of history. He did not want to even listen to it. And so in 1993, there was an agreement, not an agreement, but an accord called the Oslo Accord. And according to that accord, there was going to be an interim period, and then slowly a withdrawal of the Israeli army from the Palestinian West Bank and Gaza. Instead, Israel started building settlements and taking land of the Palestinians and building settlements. And the pace of the settlement building has changed over the years and has become much more speeded up after the Likud party took over and after Netanyahu took over. And then by now there are about 500,000 settlers, over 500,000 settlers living in the occupied West Bank. And so in 2002, there was a revolt in the occupied territories, and it's called the Second Intifada. And after that, Israel took extreme measures, including stopping the communication between Gaza and the West Bank, and closure of the West Bank and building of the wall. And all of this has meant that the separation between the Palestinians and the Israelis became much more acute and much more total. And then in October 7, after Gaza was under a siege for 16 years, and Israel was refusing to negotiate in any way, there was the outbreak, and Hamas broke the walls and the fences and attacked Israel in the south and killed these people and so on, and that started the war.
Let's talk about what's going on in Gaza now. And I would like you to provide this information through an example of your friend. In one of the texts you wrote in last weeks, you told a story of your friend Al-Zayem. It was extremely moving. You called him on the phone and asked how he was doing in Gaza. Could you please recall that conversation to all those who still have no idea what is going on, what's happening in there?
Al-Zayem is a lawyer, a very successful lawyer who lives in Gaza city. And he was told by the Israelis to move away from Gaza, which is in the north, and to move south to the southern part of Gaza. And he decided to do that. And on the way, he saw some people who were moving, being bombed, and 70 people died on the way. So it was very frightening. And then he got to the south, and then he was he was surrounded by people who were being bombed, and so he wasn't safe at all in the south. And I told him, why did you move? He said, it wasn't safe at all. They were bombing all around me. Now, the other friend I have is Raja Shehadeh, who's the head of the human rights group in Gaza. And he decided not to move. He stayed in his house. And then a few days later, his house was bombed, and he miraculously escaped death. And then he had to leave the house and move to his brother's house, also in Gaza City, because he did not decided not to move. And the point is that Israel is trying to move the people in the north into the south, as if the south is safe, but the south is not safe because it is being bombed continuously. And the way from the north to the south is also not safe because it's being bombed continuously. But the idea of Israel, it seems that they want to empty the Gaza Strip and move all the people out into Sinai. And I read in the beginning of the war, Netanyahu saying, we want Gaza to become a deserted island. And it didn't strike me what deserted really meant at that point. And now I understand he wants an actually deserted place. He wants to empty Gaza of its people and move them away into into Egypt, into the Sinai. And the people, of course, who have been many of the people in Gaza are refugees who have been evicted out of their homes by force by Israel in 1948. So they are aware of the Israeli tactic and they do not want another Nakba, another catastrophe to befall them. And so they've decided to stay. And yet they are being bombed mercilessly, And it's just amazing. I was watching the Jazeera English news just before this interview, and one person who is in the Shatti beach camp was speaking in I mean, it broke my heart. He was saying, when will the world finally listen, and how can they be so heartless? Because I'm living here, and all around me are bombings, and my children are worried and afraid, and I don't know where to go, and I can't go anywhere because everywhere is unsafe. And if we move out, it's and he was holding a torch because there's no electricity and it was complete darkness, and the holding of a torch to his face. So it was. He was pleading to the people of the world to listen to him, to listen to the tragedy of Gaza. He says, "We're all civilians. Why are we being bombed?" And it was heartbreaking.
Yes, the argument is usually as follows: that Israel has the right to defend itself, but the measures taken lead to mass destruction, to, as you said, the state in which part of Gaza is completely deserted. That's how it looks like now, right?
Yeah, that's what they want. And they said from the beginning, no restraints. These are, they call the Palestinians human animals. And so there's going to have no electricity, no water, no fuel, and there's no limit to what they will bomb. And they've been bombing schools, bakeries, hospitals, churches, mosques. It's just outrageous. And all of this because they say they are doing defending Israel. Well, how do you defend Israel? By killing civilians in this massive way? Of course, the best way to defend Israel is to make peace with the Palestinians, but that's not on the agenda at all.
Let's talk about the past, Raja. You mentioned Oslo Accord, and according to this Oslo Accord, the Gaza Strip and the West Bank should have been a single territorial unit. It should be united somehow, but it never happened. Why was it, and what was the communication between these two territories? How did it work in the past?
Well, in the past, from 1967 until 1993, really, the whole country, Israel and Palestine and the occupied territories, was open, and one could move everywhere without any restraints. And then in the first Intifada, they started blocking and putting blocks and checkpoints, and so that became a little more difficult to move. And then they closed Jerusalem, and you couldn't go to Jerusalem from the West Bank. And in the Oslo Accords, they said there would be a corridor between the West Bank and Gaza, a safe corridor, and that was never implemented. And at the same time, they closed Gaza to the West Bankers so that you couldn't go without a permit, and the permits were very difficult to get. And so the clause in the Oslo Agreement that the West Bank and Gaza are one integral unit was never implemented, was never a reality. And so in a way it was as if they were preparing for this, because by blocking people, Israelis also from visiting the West Bank and Gaza, and Palestinians from visiting Gaza, they were making the Palestinians live in the separate units and reducing the contact between the Israelis and the Palestinians, so that whatever they say about the Palestinians could be believed because they don't know them personally. They haven't visited. They don't know that there are ordinary people living on the other side. And that now we see that they are bombing in that terrible way, and there's no reaction in Israel by people saying, what are we doing? We should stop.
You haven't visited Gaza since 1999, and back then it was possible to visit Gaza for you only because a permit was issued by the World Bank, for which you were a legal consultant on one of their projects. That shows how difficult it is for people in the West Bank and in Gaza. It shows how distant these two lands are?
Well, before 1990, I was visiting Gaza, but after the closure, it became very difficult and impossible unless you make great efforts. And that was the only time from 1990. That was the last time that I visited Gaza, and exactly because of what we said, because I had the permit from the organized by the World Bank. Yeah.
Israel says that it must protect itself. It must protect itself from bombing, from terrorist attacks, from intifadas, or attacks like this one attack of Hamas from 7th of October. But the relationship between Israel's government and Hamas is much more complicated. You wrote in one of your articles that since Netanyahu took office for a second time in 2019, he has pursued a policy of strengthening Hamas at the expense of the Palestinian Authority that governs the West Bank. Why did he do that, and how did he do that?
Well, Netanyahu has always been searching for excuses why there should be no negotiations. And it was very convenient for him to say that there's no negotiations because there isn't a unified group, because there is Palestinian Authority on the West Bank and Hamas on the Gaza. And in order to keep that illusion, rather than allow possibilities for integration or bringing Hamas into politics, into negotiations, he allowed the Qataris to give money to Hamas from 2009, billions of dollars to Hamas, to strengthen Hamas, in order to keep that illusion that Israel cannot negotiate because there isn't a unified Palestinian leadership. And so that was how it happened. And then he kept thinking that if he can manage the conflict, not resolve it, manage it by keeping the pressure on Hamas and on the Gaza Strip, but not bring it to a point of boiling, then everything would be all right. And so he started, for example, allowing Gaza laborers to work in Israel and get more money from Israel through their work in Israel. And he thought that this would alleviate a little bit of the poverty there and so on. But he was always thinking in terms of managing the conflict rather than resolving it. And he stopped every possibility, whoever suggested it, from resolving the conflict.
You wrote that the cycle of revenge and counter-revenge should be ended, that it should be put into an end, because this cycle demolishes both nations. Palestinians are being killed. Israelis live in a very special, very strange, very awkward position when they have to think about the war all the time. How could we achieve this goal? How could we achieve this ending of this cycle of revenge and counter-revenge?
Well, I think the point to be understood is that in the small area of land, Palestine, Israel, two nations exist. And these two nations must live together, somehow find a way of living together. And any attempt at assuming that you can get rid of or defeat or annihilate or keep the other party under stress by taking their land and them under siege is a false start. And the problem is that America, the United States, gives so much money to Israel and so much weaponry that they bring them to the illusion that they can continue to wage war and win through the war. And that is a false illusion. So the way to move forward is to negotiate with the Palestinians and negotiate a separation and a division of the land and a way of living together that eventually must be found, because otherwise it's impossible to keep on fighting. And so, go on.
Yeah, but to negotiate, there must be a recognition, mutual recognition, before you sit at the table to negotiate terms, any terms. People must recognize themselves as people. And as you wrote, now Palestinians are presented as homini sacris. This term comes from Giorgio Agamben's philosophy of politics, and it refers to a group of persons to whom you can do anything. So we lack even these. We lack the recognition that is the foundation of any negotiation.
Absolutely. Well, Israel keeps saying that the Palestinians do not recognize Israel, but in fact, the recognition of Israel by the Palestinians happened in the course of the Oslo Accords. In the Oslo Accords, there is a letter signed by Arafat, who was the leader then, saying that we recognize the state of Israel. And in 2002, the Arab countries, Arab League, accepted the proposal by the Saudi Arabia for an initiative called Arab Initiative, whereby the Arabs would normalize relations, all the Arab states would normalize relations with Israel, provided Israel ends the occupation and goes back to this 1967 borders. And Israel never accepted that. So we still are stuck with the fact that Israel does not recognize the Palestinians as a nation, as a people entitled to self-determination. Whereas I think the Palestinians have come to recognize Israel in many instances, and Israel never took that as as a start for negotiations.
You wrote that revenge can't bring security. It's a fundamental rule, but revenge is being used to rule the people, and not only in Israel, also in Gaza. How to neutralize this? How to fight with this form of politics?
Well, it's not only Gaza, and it's also the West Bank, because West Bank there's a lot of settler violence, and the settlers are taking the occasion of the war in Gaza to increase their violence against Palestinians, and 13 communities have been have had forced to leave their communities and move elsewhere in the West Bank. And just yesterday, there was an attack on their Sharaf, a village near Nablus, where the settlers burnt places and were very violent against the Palestinians. And it's almost daily now that there are violence by the settlers against the Palestinians. So the attempt is also in the West Bank to move the Palestinians out of what is called Area C, which is under Israeli power now. That's part of the West, 60% of the West Bank, and move them to Area A and B, which are the small 19%, and so really in a ghetto.
But what I meant was that Hamas also uses the revenge as the way to, govern the people in Gaza. That on the side of Hamas, in its ideology, there is also this revenge as the tool to govern the society.
Well, Hamas is the government, so it has lots of functions of the government functions. And Hamas, it's true, was not willing to recognize Israel for the longest time. But then in 2017, they made an amendment to their platform and recognized Israel and were willing to come to terms with Israel in some way. But again, Israel did not take that, and they didn't encourage that process. And the United States also does not help, because the United States has declared Hamas is a terrorist organization, and if it's a terrorist organization, then it's not part of politics, and it's not helping it to enter politics. And that is why when they cannot enter politics, they go into other methods which are not necessarily good. And so, I mean, the recognition has to be that Hamas and Israel and Palestinians and so on have to negotiate and accept each other. Otherwise, it can't happen.
Of course, it's very difficult when the outrageous acts are being done. What is happening in Gaza has the character of a chain reaction. The long-standing occupation of the Palestinian territories leads to a devastating brutalization of social relationships, and people suffer from it. It's not only that they suffer from occupation, they suffer also from the brutalization of social relationships, their relationships with each other. Could you tell us more about it?
You mean the relations between Israelis and Palestinians?
No, the Palestinians themselves. The Palestinians themselves, you know, when you are occupied all the time, that's how I imagine the situation. When you are occupied all the time, then it changes the form of your relationships with the world, with other people living with you in on the same street. It's not normal you cannot have a normal way of life.
The Palestinians in Gaza suffered a lot from the siege, of course, but I think that they managed more or less to keep their society intact, and that's very important, very difficult under these circumstances. But in a way, religion has been a good factor in that sense, in keeping the society together and keeping families together and so on. But it's been a very unusual way of life to be under siege and not to have a future and not to have access to the world and not to be able to travel and not to be able to leave its tiny area. But still they managed, I think, under these very difficult conditions to build hospitals, to build a university that is very good, which has now been destroyed, of course. And so in many ways, they managed under these very difficult conditions.
The question about this brutalization of social relationships came to my mind after reading Asma al-Ataun's novel, The Lost Image. She portrays the group of blacks who make up 1% of Gaza's population, and they are the victims of internal racism. And she presents it as the consequence of this brutalization of social relationships caused by the occupation, caused by the siege. So it's just like a vicious circle of violence and of hatred and of suffering.
I'm sure that's true, but I'm always surprised at the fact that it isn't much worse than it is now, because people are under so much pressure that you would imagine that they would be much acting in a much worse way than they actually are now. So even now, with all this bombing and so on, they try to help each other and to share things and to do their best to each other. So it's quite amazing that it's not worse in that sense.
Sometimes I come across this opinion from people that live elsewhere, for example in Poland, that it is safer in the West Bank. But as you said, West Bank is also occupied. West Bank has also acts of terror. How does it look like from the perspective of Ramallah, where you are based, where you live?
Well, now Ramallah is subject to the entry of the soldiers every night. They come in town and arrest people, and then all the roads around Ramallah are closed, and so it's very difficult for vegetables to come in from Palestinian vegetable growers, and it's very difficult to move around from place to place. And on the road, you can encounter settler violence and people who might shoot at you and throw stones at the car and so on. And then the Israelis come and demolish homes like they did the other day in nearby. So all these things that they have been doing, they're doing more of. So at the same time, it's a restricted life, but we are not under the bombardment that the people in Gaza are suffering. So it's much easier in that sense for us.
You wrote that not ceasefire or a truce, but a comprehensive resolution. That's what we need. That's what is needed. What if there is no such resolution? What if the situation between Israel and Palestine will not be resolved comprehensively? What should we expect, in your opinion?
Well, I think that after this war, it's difficult to imagine how people can continue after this war, because it has been such a massive genocide really, of the people of Gaza. And so the big question is whether the United States, which is the staunchest ally of Israel and which is the paying all the money for Israel to keep going in that way and giving them the arms to keep going and to keep bombing and so on, whether the United States would realize that they have to pressure Israel and pursue a peace conference that would try and resolve the conflict. The other thing that is very important is whether the International Criminal Court would finally act and take action against Israelis who have committed crimes, war crimes, and there are many of them now. And if this happens, then the Israelis might think twice before they commit war crimes. And that did not happen in the past, although there were war crimes committed in the previous Gaza incursions. And that's because the criminal court has refused to act. And that's also because of the intervention of the Britain and America and Western countries that stopped the court and put pressure on it not to act. Although in the case of the Ukraine, the criminal court has acted very quickly and taken action. And that's not the case with Palestine and Israel.
You also wrote that there is some comfort to be found in the fact that leaders of surrounding countries are preventing another Nakba. This sentence seems particularly important to me as it points to an elementary need of the Palestinians. It's not just about survival, it's about being at home, in your own home. Only being at home in times of peace can make the peace fully just.
That's right.
Comment upon this?
Yeah, you know, in 1948, when the war started, people were immediately thought that they should leave and that they would be able to come back after the war ends. And so they left and without taking much of without taking anything really. And then they were not allowed to return. And that was a big lesson for the Palestinians, never to leave their homes. And so when Israel said for the Palestinians in Gaza to leave, the Palestinians stayed put, generally stayed put and didn't leave. But also the Arab states, Egypt, for example, has not allowed the Palestinians to move out, although this can be inhuman also because some people need to go to move in order to get medical help or something. Now they're doing a little bit of that. They're allowing some people with medical needs to leave, but a very small number. But had Egypt opened the Rafah border for anyone who wants to leave, there might have been a flood of people because people have had enough, too much suffering under the bombardment of Israel. So in one way, Palestinians have stayed put and realized they don't want another Nakba, but at the same time, they are being bombed so mercilessly that if they stay, they're going to be, many of them are going to be destroyed. I mean, the numbers of the death is terrible.
In the past, you represented people in the court when settlers took their lands. You were very active with Al-Hak. You wrote books. Now you write articles. You're a spokesman of Palestinian nation. But what are you doing daily, Raja, now? How do you survive in this situation? How does it look like in Ramallah now?
You know, my interest in I am not, first of all, I'm not a spokesman for the Palestinians at all. I speak my own mind, and I'm not a spokesman. And at the same time, my interest in writing is literary writing, not articles of this sort. But now I find myself needing to explain how things are by writing articles of that sort, and especially to newspapers and magazines that are in the United States, which are not peripheral, not read by the converted. So I wrote to the New York Times, I wrote to the New York Review of Books, I wrote to the Guardian newspaper and in Britain, and I wrote to the Atlantic. And these media are not usually read, are usually read by the mainstream. And that it's very important for me to write for the mainstream rather than for the already converted. And that was not possible a few years ago because there was not interest in listening to the Palestinians at all. Now, in the past, I was working with Al-Hak as on a volunteer basis, of course, because I'm a lawyer and I was working on the side with Al-Hak. And what we did, and what I did mainly, was to try and explain how the settlements were being built and how the land was being taken and how the law in the West Bank was being distorted to allow for this to happen. And so I started by small books, and then I wrote the Occupiers' Law, in which I put together all the information, and I tried to make it as popular as possible so that people can understand what is happening, with the idea that if they understand and if the world knows, then they will stop it. And so this was false because they didn't. Even when they understood, even when I explained everything, even when Al-Haq had documentation of all the violations that were happening, nothing happened, nothing changed. And so it's very frustrating in a sense. And now I'm trying to write these articles with the hope also that the world can move and understand and understand things better. And it doesn't seem to be working either. But that at least gives me something to do. And my preference is not to do this kind of work, but to do my literary writing, which has now stopped because I have to do these articles.
Toward the end of Palestinian Walks, you write about Louise Vaux, a writer who took a volunteer job in Palestine. And during one of the walks in your company, she said that life for Palestinians is a constant wait. You wait for permission to cross the border. You wait for a pass to be issued. You have to be at the airport earlier than others to be sure that you will be allowed to enter the airport. How do you guys put up with all these? Louise asked. Why don't you scream? I think that this question should be replaced today with another one. Why doesn't the world hear? Why does the world pretend not to hear your cries? You said that you are writing these articles and nothing changes. Why is that? Why the world does not hear the cries of Palestinians?
Well, I think the Israeli position and Israeli propaganda is so strong, and Israeli power and the Zionist power in various places so strong that they are not allowing the Palestinian voice to really be heard. The Zionists are very powerful in the world, and they always have ways of countering the thing. For example, they use the Holocaust a lot. They use the Jewish suffering a lot, as if it can justify anything. And so and then they also have power with the government. So the U.S. government is unwilling. For example, Biden has been unwilling to touch the Palestinian issue and Israeli-Palestinian conflict, because he thought that why should I have a headache? Why should I get into something that will only give me a headache? And he left it. And because he left it, things have become much worse. And now he's saying that he will concentrate on this a little more, and then we shouldn't go back to the previous condition status. And he is saying that there needs to be a new vision for the Middle East. But whether he means it, whether he will act on it, whether he will be allowed to act on it by the Zionist lobbies, I don't know. Now, the thing that did happen, which is important, is that in the past, the Zionists who were, of course, pro-Israeli, were accepting everything that Israel was saying, and they were encouraging the settlers and so on. Now they've come to a point, many of them, where they realize that this is hurting Israel, that this is not good for Israel, and so they have changed and started to become a little more critical. And so there is a very important development now with many Zionists who are not happy with what Israel is doing, and they are trying to save it from itself. But they are not majority yet, they are in the minority. But it's an important development.
When you came to Krakow a few years ago, you told me that as bad as things are, you resist giving into despair. And I found the same line in one of your recent articles. You said why it is important to be on the side of hope. But where do you find strength to go on, Raja?
Well, I think that it's impossible not to hope, and it's impossible to give up, because my life is here and my future is here, and I cannot abandon. And so I have to be always working hard and trying and so on. And it's very important for me. Otherwise, I will have no. I realize also that if I leave, I cannot leave. I mean, I can physically leave, but I will not. The main thing on my mind would be here and what is happening here. And in a way, I cannot leave, because I cannot be. I cannot divorce myself from the situation here. And so I accept the fact that I have to be here, and I accept the fact that I have to work as hard as I can and keep on trying, and always feel that there is always a possibility that something will change and things will develop. And I know that eventually the two nations have to live together. And also my father, of course, Aziz Shehadeh, he worked very hard for proposing a Palestinian state. And he, after 1967, to live side by side with Israel. And recently I've written a book about him and about his politics. And the book is called We Could Have Been Friends, My Father and I. And in the book he says, the only victory is when we've both won. And that is something that I believe very strongly in. And fortunately, the book is being read and people are being attentive to his message. And now it has won, it's a finalist in the National Book Award in the United States. So that tells you that there is change, that something might be happening that is can make things different than they are now. So it's not all glim.
Let's hope for that, Raja. Thank you for the conversation. Thank you for sharing all these thoughts with us, with me, and with the viewers of the nature of the future. And Raja, please stay safe. Stay safe.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you.